one of the best pieces of advice I received.
What makes Airbnb so successful?
I would say over the course of 10 years, I bet you it's less work.
And it comes a point in any company's history where you start to think and reflect. And we've been thinking a lot about what it means to travel.
But I'm going to focus on things that a lot of marketers and communication professionals, startup founders and leaders can learn from Airbnb, and we can make our companies, our brands successful too. So stay till the end of the video to watch what this is all about.
Did anybody tell you it was a good idea?
No, I mean, it was pretty universally considered a terrible idea.
And some of the lessons of why Airbnb is so successful is hidden in Brian Chesky's interviews and talks. So I'm going to play 3 clips, and after that I'm going to narrate the story behind each one of them, and then we are going to deconstruct some of the lessons that we could learn from Airbnb to become successful like Brian Chesky and his brand. So the first one is, when asked what is Airbnb or how did Airbnb start, this is what Brian Chesky says.
And it turns out that Joe said, well, the rent is $1,150. So I actually can't pay rent.
Fantastic. So that was an interesting story. The second thing, when launching or while launching Airbnb trips or Airbnb experiences back in 2016, this is how Brian Chesky presented
What it means to travel, the purpose of travel.
Brilliant, pretty interesting. But we want to know how it ended, right? So we will go ahead and take a look at that as well. But the third example is slightly not a happy one, but still there's lots to learn from that. This is when he was faced with probably the most difficult communication that he had to do in his career, and that was asking people to leave his company. Okay, so now let's deconstruct what is it that makes Airbnb so successful. Like I said, there are many different things that make them successful, but one of them, and a very important one at that, is Airbnb's focus and understanding of storytelling. Yes, you heard that right. Brian Chesky is a big believer in storytelling, and they use storytelling almost in every aspect of their business. So I'm going to start off with the first aspect. You heard what Brian Chesky had to say when he was asked how the company started. So he narrates this particular story, and I'll let him narrate that for you.
As we had this idea, we said, well, what if we just turned our house into a bed and breakfast for a design conference?
So interesting story, right? 3 broke designers in San Francisco who could not make rent, and then they started this Airbed and Breakfast initiative. 5 people came and stayed with them. They became friends. That's how they realized that they were on to something. And Brian Chesky never ever misses an opportunity of narrating this particular story. Why? Because he understands how powerful an asset a good origin story is. And
we had this idea, we said, well, what if we just turned our house into a bed and breakfast?
And this is the story that gets narrated all of the time. But you may wonder, or you may think that Airbnb just has an origin story. No, it does not. It probably is one of those companies which has the most number of stories that they have shared with people, through journalists, through their blogs, etc., etc. So there's this really interesting book called The Airbnb Story, written by Lee Gallagher. Fascinating book. I really loved reading the book, and I recommend that all of us read the book. And in that book, you'll come across so many different stories. So one other story was the fact that in 2008, Brian Chesky and Joe Gebbia had ran huge credit card debt. They did not know how to, pay for the debt because they were not finding any investors for the company. And then they actually decided to create special edition boxes, cereal boxes called Obama's O's and Captain McCain's, and they were lucky. They were actually sold about 1,000 boxes which were inspired by Obama and made about $40,000 US. That helped them survive, but it also gave them a runway for a few months, and that is an interesting story. Now, the more interesting part is that this story is something that they've narrated to investors. It's also something that they've narrated to journalists, etc. And through the course of Airbnb's time, you will see that the company has narrated so many interesting anecdotes about itself that it is sort of a web of stories that you get entangled in. It's almost like a movie that you get invested in or a story that you get invested in. And that's how they have built their startup, apart from the all other fantastic tech work and many different things that they do. So the first lesson from Airbnb's journey is to spot, structure, and narrate your stories from time to time. Now, many of us, when we are building our companies, we are so operations focused that we are not able to identify the interesting moments in the company's life or the company's journey. And it's important for us to have that third person perspective and keep noting these things down and narrate them through blogs, through talks, through podcasts, through everywhere possible, because stories is how we build connections with other human beings. And at the end of the day, whether it is a brand, a business, or anything else, we are dealing with people. So in the beginning of the video, when I played the clip from Airbnb's Airbnb Trips launch, you saw that Brian Chesky spoke about the fact that how travel has the promise of being magical, but it ends up being not so magical. And also, if you want to make it magical, then you have to undergo a huge research project, and which means that it's not really easy. But when he concluded the presentation, concluded that particular statement, this is what he had to say.
Homes, experiences, and places together, all in one place. We've designed this to be both magical and easy.
Now, if you see, a lot of entrepreneurs, leaders, and people who are presenting or launching products, or even for that matter making a pitch, we tend to fall into the trap of just talking about the benefits and features of the product, and we don't really narrate the entire story of the context of why the product is important to consumers' lives. And in this particular case, Brian Chesky uses or starts off by talking about, the fact that there is a hero who's a traveler, and he or she actually is dreaming about great lands and epic adventures. But to get to the epic adventures, he or she has to undergo a lot of research, or they are not going to get the epic adventure at all. And that is where Airbnb Trips comes in, which is magic made easy. And that is pretty much like the tagline or the name of the movie. So think of it like it was a movie, and probably Airbnb Trips name would be Magic Made Easy. So Brian Chesky and the team at Airbnb really understands the power of using storytelling models to build narratives for their communication and even for their products. And this is something that a lot of us can learn from. So there are a few storytelling models that you can use for brand communication. I'll talk about that towards the end of the video. But the second lesson for me is to use storytelling models to build interesting narratives. Okay, now we'll move on to lesson number 3, and that's equally interesting. Lesson number 3 is that in the same presentation, if you look at some bits, he talks about the hero's journey, how travel actually mirrors the hero's journey, which was identified by Joseph Campbell, American mythologist, who said that all stories are pretty much like hero's journey, where the hero leaves home, he's been called for an adventure, called for some kind of action, but he's reticent, he has self-doubt, etc., and he meets a mentor along the way who then gives him the confidence, and then he fights his battles, wins the gold, wins the girl, and comes back home. Or if it is a girl, then he wins the guy, she wins the guy and comes back home. So that's the entire premise of the hero's journey. And when Brian Chesky and his team looked at this, they looked at travel, it seemed like it was similar, and that is why they decided that when people are traveling to another country, another place, the host who's providing them the accommodation is a mentor only for a very short period of time, only when they are sleeping or staying at home. But most people spend time outdoors, or they are exploring a place, and that is where they need a mentor as well. And that's how people who provide experts or people who provide local experiences are nothing but mentors on Airbnb trips or experiences, and that is how they decided to launch this particular product. So it's pretty much like storytelling, or stories is what inspired them to launch a new, very important initiative. Now the reason for this is that they use this process called storyboarding. Storyboarding is where you think of a character and you're looking at different points in time or different moments in that character's journey and sort of creating illustrations out of that. This is a job of people who do storyboarding, animators, etc. They understand this really well. Brian Chesky read Walt Disney's biography, and in that book, he realized that when Disney went from making animated shorts, they used to make really short movies, animated movies, to making a full-length feature animated movie, he actually brought his team on the same page by making sure that there was some kind of storyboarding and everybody understood the different moments in the character's journey. And Brian Chesky got inspired by that idea, and that is how now Airbnb uses storyboarding as a process for design, for products, for marketing, communication, etc., etc. So that's the third lesson. Use storyboarding as far as possible to be able to understand the customer or the user's journey, as opposed to looking at things from your perspective, because you may or may not understand what the customer is going through or what the user is going through or what are the specific challenges that he or she is facing. That was lesson number 3. Now I'll come to the final lesson, which is also a pretty important one, and that's something I think I noticed when Brian Chesky had to ask people to leave, about 1/4 of his staff in the wake of the pandemic. Now, a lot of blogs were written about how well they managed this particular thing, but what was interesting is that 2 things. One, Brian Chesky spoke to his staff, wrote a very honest and transparent letter. Also on the Zoom call when he was addressing his employees, he did not hide his tears, that he was really sad about the fact that he had to ask people to leave and he had no option but to, and that people who were being asked to leave the company were not really bad employees. In fact, many of them were really good performers. It's just that they did not have an option during that particular point of time. So his honesty is something that really cut through a lot of people, both the employees and the media and other general audiences as well. But what's also important is that they took a few specific actions, things like letting axed employees keep their laptops, paying them severance pay, but also medical insurance for a couple of years, getting their HR team to work for the employees who were asked to leave as opposed to the employees who were already in the company, so on and so forth. They took 3-4 really solid initiatives which gave the message that they were serious about the fact that they did not want to let go of people. Now, this is what I think is called triggering stories. So basically, when somebody doesn't expect you to do something and you do that, then that person starts talking about it. And I think the same thing happened over here as well. This was probably the first time that a company which was asking people to leave had taken these kind of initiatives, and the media spoke about it, and that also gave Airbnb positive PR out of an event which probably no company ever in history has been able to get positive PR out of. So that's my 4th lesson. Look at what is it that people want but don't expect from you, and if you do that, you will be able to trigger stories for your company, for your brand. Those were my 4 lessons from Airbnb's journey, and if you're able to implement this, I'm sure that your brand will benefit a lot from it, whether it's a business brand or a personal brand. So yes, now towards the end of the video, there is one message that I have for all of you, that these things, all of the storytelling models, stories that you're going to use, in business, storytelling is strategic, and that is why I think it's important to invest in learning storytelling. So there are many books out there which you can use. There are courses. My company, The Story Co, also runs workshops and courses on storytelling. We also coach founders and executives on how to use the power of stories in their communication. So if you're interested in any of that, please feel free to let me know in the comments. If you have any questions about business storytelling, just leave them in the comments. Either I or one of my team members will get to it shortly. That's it from me in this video. The next time you're traveling somewhere, if you remember this video, you'll probably book an Airbnb, or maybe not, I don't know. But that's it from me in this video. I'll see you in the next one pretty soon. Bye.